Buzzkillers, it's me, the old professor here. You know, one thing I love and hate is the fact that there are so many things I have to, or that I bring up on the show that nobody knows about. It's not just busting myths, it's about revealing things or talking about things that either people don't know about or should be known more, especially things that have been kind of forgotten. And one of my favorite films of all time is the 1946 Hollywood blockbuster, The Best Years of Our Lives, which won the Oscar, among other things. And yet, compared to It's a Wonderful Life, The Best Years of Our Lives in the last 20 or 30 years has been almost forgotten. Well, but fortunately for all of you out there, Buzzkillers, we have Dr. Alison Macor on the line, whose book, Making the Best Years of Our Lives, is now out in paperback. Of course, it's on the Buzzkill Bookshop. We'll talk about that later. And she's here with us via the internet. So, so happy to have you on, Dr. Macor. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Please, before this is one of my favorite films. It's been one of my favorite films for a very, very long time, and I will bend people's ear about it endlessly. So I hope I don't do that during the show, because we want you to bend people's ear about it, because you're the actual expert. This is a fascinating book, a real page turner. I learned so much about the film, but also about Hollywood and about other things that we'll get to in the show. Can you tell us first just the basics of the film and why, for instance, it won the Oscar the year that It's a Wonderful Life came out, and why it was the most popular film for years and years and years and years and years, and yet nowadays it's hardly known.
Oh, where to start with that?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. No. There's a lot to say. And again, I'm thrilled to talk about it. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for reading the book. So just to put it in context, this is one of my favorite films. I saw it when I was in my 20s, probably, as a master's student at the University of Texas at Austin. And, when you're training to become a film professor, you see everything, right? You take all the classes and you don't always love everything, even though you're supposed to, or, supposed to have respect for it. But this one, Best Years, just really knocked me down. And in part, it was because of what I knew about Hollywood at the time, right? 1946, the production code, the sort of censorship issues. And here was somebody on the screen with hooks for hands. And that really blew me away. And even, the adult content, I was really like, whoa.
Yeah.
And, as I went on and became an instructor and then a professor, I just taught it all the time, because it's such a versatile film, right? It's an independent, It's a blockbuster at the same time. It's star-studded, and it hit all these marks that you kind of alluded to, all the Oscar wins, and it set records with its box office. And Life magazine, I love this quote, Life magazine called it the first big good movie of the post-war era to address post-war trauma, which means it wasn't the first, right? But it did it in such a way that it really captured people's imagination. It really spoke to people about their veterans and their lives and what they were going through. It came out in 46. And so it was under consideration for the Academy Awards in the ceremony in 47, March of 47. That year also, there were some big changes to how the Academy was voting, which, I didn't know until I started really going into it. And so it's really, to me, came out at a time when Hollywood itself was changing.
Right.
The film came out for Oscar consideration in November of 46. And within a year, as I write in the book, suddenly you've got the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating Hollywood, resuming that investigation. It had happened before. And suddenly, Best Years, along with It's a Wonderful Life, they were appearing on lists of films with communist propaganda in them. So it was this complete turn. And I think all of that just really compelled me. When I was looking around for a next book, I was like, wow, not only do I love this film, but it really sits at this crossroads of fascinating things in Hollywood at that time. And, you talk about people not really knowing it today. And that is one of the things that pushed me to write about it. Definitely. And I can tell you, running into people in the film industry, I live in Austin, Texas, and running into people who are in the film industry in Target. I remember having a conversation with somebody and saying, yeah, what's your next book about? Oh, The Best Years of Our Lives. And this kind of glassy look coming over. thinking, surely this person has seen this
Yeah.
film. So I was like, oh gosh, I want to write about it. But at the same time, since I've written the book, I've also heard from people who are, of a certain generation that actually are familiar with the film and have seen it in interesting ways. We're introduced to it by older relatives, or for instance, the comedian John Mulaney was interviewed while I was working on this book, I think in the New York Times, and he spoke about how influential the movie was to him growing up. And he's 40, I think. So I found that fascinating too.
Well, Professor, we're talking about a movie that we think, at least I think, certainly most people haven't seen and should see. Also, I'll go back to that at the end of the show over and over. Please, please, please give us the basics of the plot.
All right. So there are these three veterans from different branches of the military, and they meet when they catch the same transport plane back home to their hometown, Boone City, fictional Boone City. Fred is played by Dana Andrews, and he's an Air Force captain. He's heading home to his wife, Marie, played by Virginia Mayo. And they were married just before he headed overseas. So, don't know each other very well. Homer, played by Harold Russell, who was not an actor, he was an actual disabled vet, is a sailor who lost both of his hands when his aircraft carrier was torpedoed. And then you have Frederick March playing Sergeant Al Stevenson, and he is eager to return to his wife, Millie, played by Myrna Loy, but he's conflicted about his job at the bank.
But what I find so interesting about the very, very beginning of the film is that it's extremely long. And what I mean by this is, and Buzzkills will notice this immediately when they watch the film, the three of them are hanging around in this Air Force or military depot transport. It takes a long time. They're waiting to get a plane, and luckily, if they're willing to sit in the gunnery glass bubble in front of a plane, they can go.
Yeah.
And they sit in the middle in this gunnery ball. The three of them stuck in there together. Takes forever to get to Boone City. They get home. They don't want to go home. They each make excuses about not wanting to get from the airport to their home. But when they finally do, they must have gone 2 or 3 days without showering. And what I've always thought about the show is, here are these three guys that show up absolutely reeking in Boone City, and yet you see none of you see none of that in the thing. Everyone is happy to have them back, but I wouldn't want to go home before I'd had a shower anyway, given how long it took them to get home.
Well, Al does say that, right? When he sees Millie, he's like, "Oh, I haven't had a shower. My face, I've got to shave." I would argue, I have never served in the military, although my college roommate did, that their noses were probably immune by that point to certain smells, and their desire to get home. And one of the reasons why their trip lasts so long is they're catching a ride, right? So they're stopping, the plane is making stops all along the route. And it's the best deal they can get. And it's also a sort of a symbol of what's to come in a lot of ways. Like, this is going to be a hard journey.
Well, yeah, and in the military depot, it's like catch can. It's like, trying to get you here, trying to get you there. Well, they sort of package together this thing for these guys. And that completely goes against the idea of the hyper efficient military bringing the boys home immediately. Once you land in the States, you could be home within a day. And it just shows that, among other things, I thought the director made that whole sequence last a long time to emphasize the difficulty of transition, but also to show that it wasn't a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the surprises for me as I wrote this book, worked on it, researched it, was, one of the things that drew me to this project was that this film really dealt with PTSD before it was called PTSD. And it did it in a very effective way. And I really wanted to investigate, as part of writing this book, when did, I knew the term PTSD sort of originated after Vietnam, but I wanted to really look at, well, how far back does that all go? So I did a lot of research. In fact, that was the first chapter I wrote, chapter 2, because it was so new to me, that subject. And I knew I was going to have to really, dive deep. And one of the things that was amazing to me is that in real life, Harold Russell, who plays Homer, as I said, he was not an actor.
Right.
He had lost his hands in, training exercise mishap. And so that was 1944. William Wyler, the director, loses his hearing while he's making documentaries overseas as part of the war effort in the spring of 45. There's less than a year between them, but both of them going through sort of Walter Reed Hospital, coming back, receive very different types of treatment. And that had much less to do with the fact that Wyler was, a Hollywood director and Russell was like a 30-something nobody, than the fact that the military was constantly like, let's try this, let's go chemicals. No, let's go back to talk therapy. And that surprised me a lot. And it gives you this sense of trying to figure things out, and really trying everything. And that surprised me a lot in doing my research for this book.
Well, let's take these characters one by one and explain them more. By the way, Buzzkillers, when we mentioned the director William Wyler, please don't confuse him with Billy Wilder, who I've confused. I confused those two for 20 years in college and taking film studies class. Anyway, there are these three different characters. They choose three different characters from three different branches of the military, right? And from three different sort of socioeconomic backgrounds.
Absolutely.
It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
May we take them one by one? You choose whichever one you want to do first and delve into their character backgrounds?
Yeah, and I'd like to point out, too, that this screenplay was adapted from a book. The book was called Glory for Me. The writer, McKinley Cantor, was paid to write it by the producer, Sam Goldwyn. It was sort of reverse engineered. His wife found a magazine article and thought it would make a good idea for a movie. Goldwyn was a big believer in having prestige source material, so he had the book written. So I just want to say that it was based on this book, but it changed a lot. So just to give a sense of where the characters came from, I'll start with Fred, who is, a flyboy. He's this Air Force captain, and while we don't see their time overseas, it's alluded to it, through conversation. In the case of Fred, there's some oral, AURAL, flashbacks that we hear. And Dana Andrews, who plays him, had made a film called Laura a couple years earlier. I mean, he was well known, and he was definitely like on the rise at the time. And so he was a heartthrob to have in this movie. And his character is interesting because he's married to Marie, played by Virginia Mayo, who she'd only done really romantic comedies and musical comedies to that point, mostly with Danny Kaye. And so for her to be in a dramatic movie was a big deal. And it was kind of a risk, honestly. Mayo liked to joke that she won Wyler the Best Director Oscar because, no one believed that she could be in a dramatic role. So he's coming back to her, and there's this great bit in the movie where he can't find her. Again, not so strange at that time. She was living with his parents, but then she moved out and got her own place because she got a job. Another factor, of the war, how many women went into the workforce and then had to leave the workforce when the men started coming back.
And we should say that, by the way, he comes from a very low economic status, but in the military, he's an officer because he was a flyboy.
Right.
So that's very, very interesting.
And he was good at what he did. We definitely get that sense. The medals, his wife says, "Oh, Freddie, look at your medals." But yes, he's the one who's dropped off last. And we can kind of see why. His parents live near the train tracks. I mean, literally on the other side of the tracks. And when we first see his dad and his dad's wife, I think, I'm not even sure they ever allude to them being married in the film, but she is not Fred's mother. We get that sense. And the dad has a bottle of alcohol out, so there's just these little things around besides the fact that, his parents' place looks a lot different than the other two domestic scenes we've just seen. So that's Fred.
And by the way, just one fun fact, Buzzkillers, Dana Andrews also played the original Ted Stryker in a sort of drama suspense movie called 0 Hour, in which he also played a pilot who's asked to pilot a plane when all the other, when the real pilots have been food poisoned. And it was actually the original movie that the comedy film in the late 70s or early 80s, whatever it was, Airplane,
Yeah.
was based on. In fact, if you watch 0 Hour, the dialogue is almost word for word. But anyway.
And what I love about that, 0 Hour has an exclamation point in the title. You know it's going to be good when there's an exclamation point in the title of the movie.
So that's Dana. That's Fred, played by Dana Andrews. He's the military-wise, he's the top dog in this group of three.
And then you've got Al Stevenson, the sergeant, who is played by Frederick March. And, he's the oldest for sure. And he comes back. And even when they pull up to his pretty swizzy apartment house, by that point, they've dropped off Homer. So that's when Fred Derry is like, were you in bootlegging? What did you do to be in this? And probably like, and why were you in the war? Which alludes to people like William Wyler himself, the director, who did not need to go to war. In fact, his wife had just had their second baby. There are lots of ways he could have gotten around that, but he wanted to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Wyler has said in interviews, sometimes he says all three characters, are a little bit of me, but he talks about Al being the one that he relates to, in part because of his place in life and also his age, and also having to come back and really kind of adapt to a world that may welcome him back, but does he even want to be a part of that life anymore? That's, I think, what that character is struggling with.
Yeah, and although he's a banker and clearly wealthy for that town, in the Army, he's just a sergeant.
Right.
So it just shows you the difference in the class and rank don't necessarily flow together.
Right. And then you have Homer Parrish, who is played by Harold Russell, and his family knows that he lost his hands, but they have yet to see him. And so that is actually the first sort of reunion that we see in the film. And it's incredibly moving, shot very pointedly in a way, to reveal the difficulties, the interpersonal dynamics, between him and his longtime girlfriend, who in true Hollywood fashion lives next door, played by newcomer Kathy O'Donnell. And then, how his family's reacting. We get a lot of medium shots and long medium shots, so we can really see these characters in their setting and see how other characters are reacting to them as they come home. And I think that's really important for us as viewers in bringing us into this story.
Yeah, it's really the first major upsetting part of the film. So then please explain to Buzzkills, how does the family react to seeing him with the hooks? Because after all, like everyone in the military at the time, they're only writing letters home. There's no email, there's certainly no video chat, there's nothing like that. They're told what happened to him, which, by the way, is his ship gets torpedoed in the military, and Harold Russell in real life dynamite in a training accident, I think. But how does his family react to seeing him like this way?
Mostly with horror, but again, because of the way it's shot, we sort of watch them all react. His father is sort of stoic about it. His girlfriend is in shock. His little sister, Luella, is just sort of stunned. It's like something out of a horror film, presumably for her. But in the script and the way it plays out on the screen, the focus is on the mother, his mother reacting. And she sort of, her voice catches, she holds back a sob, basically. And he turns and he says something along the lines of, what's wrong, Mom? And the dad says, oh, she's just, so happy to have you home. And it is a really, you feel sort of, I think as a human being is watching this, you feel for her, but you also feel for him, right? Because how many times is he going to have this reaction? How many times has he had it already in some form?
Right. Well, and then what's always struck me about the film is these guys don't want to go home. They want to take their wives and go out on the town with the other three guys. So most people think that most soldiers want to come home and stay home and see the family, but they almost immediately go out to dinner and drinks.
Mostly drinks.
Mostly drinks. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, well, I think that's understandable. It's weird being home. The magazine article on which this film was based, way back in the start of the origin story for Best Years, the reporter rides a troop train, like what we would call embedded. A reporter is embedded on this train just to kind of capture what it's like to go home. And I think I write about it in the book, uses a phrase like this strange awkwardness of coming home. There's a lot of tension and a lot of just what is it going to be like? So again, I think the movie captures that so well. And I make the connection in the book to the scene in The Hurt Locker, Catherine Bigelow's film, where Jeremy Renner is home and sort of walking dazed to the frozen food section, I believe, of the grocery store, really all the sections. And it's just that sense of, I think, what is the reality? Where do I belong? And I think it's those feelings in those gray areas that this film captures so well, which is really hard to do. And it's a hard space to sort of live in as a viewer too. So the fact that this film did so well at the box office, I think really speaks. I mean, I read the letters that were sent to the producer, about the film, letters from everyday people, about what it meant to them. And in, promoting this book, I've met people who talk about seeing this film for the first time. One gentleman was 10 years old when his mother took him to see this film in the theater. And he said he realizes now as an adult, she went to see it because she was really trying to understand what was going on with her brother who had come back from the war and just wasn't the same. And I remember saying to him, what was it like to see this film as a 10-year-old? And he said, well, the only other film I had seen, or, the type of film I had seen up to this point was like about Lassie. So it was a huge shock for me to see this movie.
So then what happens? How do they sort of adjust to life in their town, which after all is the town is Boone City, which is a fictitious name, but it's supposedly based on Cincinnati. But, it seems like a pretty small town, or at least a medium-sized city. It's not, they're not coming back to Manhattan. How do they adjust to what's going on, and how do they try to start new lives?
Well, I mean, Al goes back to the bank sooner than he'd hoped. Fred tries to find a job, swearing that he will not go back and work as a, soda jerk at the drugstore, the local drugstore. And a lot is made about Homer's getting disability pay, and sort of, I don't want to say avoiding getting used to being back home, but definitely avoiding his girlfriend, avoiding any kind of reminders of the life he had, as much as he can, of the life he had before. And there's this communal place. Homer's uncle, Butch, played by Hoagie Carmichael, has a saloon. And, through a series of coincidences, they all sort of end up there that first night back. But then it becomes this point, this sort of gathering place for good and for bad throughout the movie.
And by the way, any film that has Hoagie Carmichael in it as a supporting actor is all right in my book.
It's so funny because people ask me about Hoagie Carmichael and, like you fans, and the stuff I learned about him, honestly, I was like, Hoagie Carmichael, not tops on my list. So I'm always like, I don't want to.
Yeah, in real life, yeah.
But he's
But as a musician and as a yes, that's right. He's perfect in that role. Yeah,
he really is.
By the way, please tell the Buzzkillers about the scene where Homer is in the basement or the workshop or something. Mm-hmm. And Wilma comes in and talks to him. And then they notice there are little kids peering through the window outside looking at them. That's a brutal scene. And it just shows how much the movie is trying to get across the message that this was very, very difficult.
Yeah, it is. Brutal's the perfect word for it. So Homer's out doing target practice, with a gun, a rifle in the woodshed behind the house. And Wilma goes there to have a conversation with him, basically like, why are you avoiding me? And his little sister and her, gang of friends are sort of lurking outside, like It's very sort of like, oh, they're in the woodshed together, but it quickly turns dark, the presence of a gun. And there's that great shot where the kids are sort of all lined up against a fence. It's chilling almost. It's, to me, it's like a precursor of 50s science fiction, the way it looks and the way it feels. And Homer kind of loses it and feels like he's being, that they're looking at him, right? And I don't want to give too much away, but, reacts in a very violent way.
Well, please, at least for this scene, give too much away.
He thrusts his hooks through the glass at the kids and says, "You want to see the hooks?" And Luella starts crying, and it's a very frightening moment. And it's meant to be, and it's, I think, also meant to address the fears that people had about returning vets. Were they monsters, especially ones who had lost limbs? I mean, I think it gets at that for sure.
Yeah, in fact, he says, you want to see the hooks, you want to see the freak?
Right.
In a really, and it's very, very stark addressing. It's a very, very stark way to address this exactly what you're talking about. Do you want to see the freak?
And, when Harold Russell, the person, was rehabbing at Walter Reed, which was, understandably very difficult. There's a special ward at Walter Reed Hospital, Ward 32, where those who had lost limbs were all placed together. And it was stark. The coping mechanisms that some soldiers indulged in were sort of encouraged there by the staff, drinking happy hour starting at 11 a.m., things like that. And so that line, "Do you want to see the freak?" Harold Russell as a person really struggled with that. And there were a couple of things that helped him in his personal rehabilitation, one of which was meeting a World War I veteran who had successfully rehabbed. He had a similar injury. And another was actually appearing in an Army short called Diary of a Sergeant, which is like a 22-minute short. And that was actually
short film, you mean?
Short film, rather, yeah. How he was discovered by William Wyler and Sam Goldwyn. The short film was being shown at war bond rallies and shown. Right. It's called Diary of a Sergeant. You can find it on YouTube. The National Archives has uploaded it, and it's really a pretty amazing film.
How about the other two? How do they eventually, I don't want to say successfully settle in, because they don't. During the film, they don't really successfully settle in. But the middle stage, as they're trying to, is, I overuse this word, but it's absolutely fascinating the way it's handled in the film.
Yeah. And again, back to the gray area. I mean, I think, as I said, the film ends with a wedding, and that's all I'll say. I was a film critic for many years. I never like to give away the ending or key points, but I think it ends realistically. I don't think it's like sugarcoats things. And that's what I think the middle part that you referred to is about. It's about, the struggle. And not just for the characters, but also for their loved ones. I once had a film professor who said, using The Graduate as an example, like, as you get older, you will relate to different characters. Like, as a 20-something, you'll probably relate to Benjamin, but then you may relate to Mrs. Robinson. And when I used to say that to my students, they were horrified. Never. And I'd love to check in with them now, I was right.
Well, let's take Fred. He says, he swears he'll never go back to the drugstore as a soda jerk again, and obviously what happened.
Yeah, so he goes back. I mean, how sort of humbling that must be, because he's working with somebody who was a lesser, from his school days, and who definitely lords it over Fred, that, he is now his boss, supervisor. And Fred does his best, I think, in the job as much as he can. But his wife, Marie, it's a definite come down for her. And that's what I was getting to with, how you feel about characters. When I first saw this movie in my 20s, I just had no time for her. But now in my 50s, I have an appreciation for everything that she's given up, that she created this life for herself during the war to survive. And now she's being asked to give up a lot. And this isn't the person that she thought she married. Should she suck it up? Maybe she just doesn't have that compassion. And so maybe it's better that they're not together. Again, I think that's something that even though the production code, the Breen office, this Hollywood self-censoring entity was like, we must preserve marriage at all costs. The reality was marriages were falling apart post-war. And that, the filmmakers wanted to address that in the script for sure.
But then the drugstore thing really doesn't work out because he gets in a fight with a guy who's trying to push Homer around.
Mm-hmm.
And what does he then do?
So he leaves the drugstore and he decides to leave Boone City. And, he goes back, he packs, he just thinks there's nothing left for him there, right? His marriage is over. He has fallen in love with somebody else, but that relationship is not going to work out apparently. And he can't find a job. So he's just ready to leave. And he goes to say goodbye to his dad and his dad's wife. That's a very moving scene. Even before his dad starts reading a letter that explains really how successful his son had been and what he had suffered and gone through. The look on that actor's face, Roman Bonin, he was, a very established actor. He was in a theater group. And I think he does such a phenomenal job of just the stricken look on his face that his son has just come home and now he's leaving again.
Yeah.
So that's a really moving scene. But then his dad, after Fred leaves the apartment, his dad reads this letter that Fred doesn't want to take all his stuff. His dad finds this letter and it's this really nice voiceover of really the hero that his son was in the war. And that's a really nice way of giving us that information too.
Yeah, I thought that it was his father actually reads out the citations of the medals, because one thing, and this is, I think, very significant too, that Fred is leaving behind is his medals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really shocking. So Buzzkillers, here's a clip of his father reading these citations out to his partner, the partner, not his wife, but the partner, after Fred has left.
So long, Pop.
Hortense. Hortense. Listen to this. Sit down. Headquarters, 8th Air Force. Award of the Distinguished Flying Cross. Here. Despite intense pain, shock, and loss of blood, with complete disregard of his personal safety, Captain Derry crawled back to his bomb site, guided his formation on a perfect run over the objective, and released his bombs with great accuracy. The heroism, devotion to duty, professional skill, and coolness under fire displayed by Captain Derry under the most difficult conditions reflect highest credit upon himself and the armed forces of the United States of America. By command of Lieutenant General Doolittle.
Professor, this is the first of two clips I wanted to play because they're so moving. And again, I get back to this point of very starkly and very directly, the way the tone of voice of that actor plays his father. This is not a triumphal scene. This is not. He's very proud of what's happening, but there's also sadness in the fact that his son has done all these wonderful things for the country and yet is leaving because he can't even keep a job as a soda jerk in a crappy drugstore.
And before all of that, he hasn't been successful in finding better jobs. He's just competing against all these other people. And he may have been a superstar in the war, but that doesn't matter. And that is really kind of hit home over and over. That reading that citation, that actor, that was actually shot on the final day of production.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then how does the second clip I want to play in a minute is from Homer, but it also does a similar thing. It shows how stark this reality is. He's really trying to push his girlfriend away, and she's trying to keep getting closer and closer to him. So finally, she comes over to the house, and he actually sort of thinks, well, I've got to do this. So he takes her up to his bedroom. Now, you make very interesting points about this specific thing in the plot. Him taking her up to his bedroom.
They're unmarried. This is
Yeah.
1946. It's a pretty big deal. I mean, behind the scenes, the Breen office, again, the self-censoring entity in Hollywood, was going bananas over a single bed in Al and Millie's apartment, the married couple. You must have 2 twin beds. So imagine they're apoplectic over an unmarried couple going up to the bedroom, Homer's bedroom. And remember the scene we discussed earlier where he shoves his hooks through the glass. I mean, I write about that sequence. It really starts when Wilma comes over and she's at the door. To me, that has so many generic elements. It could be film noir, it could be horror, it could be melodrama and romance. And that's why I love it so much. So he says, I want to take you upstairs and I want to show you what your life will be like, essentially. And they go upstairs and she looks terrified, and it's just everything. It's disability, it's sex, it's men and women together. I mean, it captures all of that. And they go up to his bedroom and he's very matter of fact about, here's what my nighttime routine is, and you will have to help me with it. And I didn't make all these connections when I was a 20-something first seeing this movie, but my dad became disabled when I was in college. And I think so much of that, I can really understand how moving that all is because, I saw what he went through. And so I think that's why that whole sequence is really one of my favorites in this movie, because it is just so authentic.
Well, and also to literally show her what happens. He takes his hooks off, which is not, which is fairly not complicated maybe, but is not just like taking off your watch. He has to really sort of unstrap them from himself.
I mean, you talk about a vulnerable moment. He's revealing his stumps, right? And it is really kind of shocking. I remember some of my students, I always joke, these were the bad ones, who were just like, how did they make those special effects in 1946? I'm like, oh God, can I just fail you now, please? But yeah, it was a pretty bold thing to have him. And it's also, I think I refer to it like this in the book, it's a training moment in the film to every couple who's grappling with this. This is how our lives and our relationship will have to change.
Right. Okay. And now here, Buzzkillers, is the audio of Homer explaining to Wilma what life is going to be like if she wants to stay with him. Because after all, he's trying to say, I'm pushing you away for a reason. Anyway, here's the audio.
I've learned how to take this harness off. I can wiggle into my pajama top. I'm lucky I have my elbows. Some of the boys don't, but I can't button them up.
I'll do that, Homer.
This is when I know I'm helpless. My hands are down there on the bed. I can't put them on again without calling to somebody for help. I can't smoke a cigarette or read a book. If that door should blow shut, I can't open it and get out of this room. I'm as dependent as a baby that doesn't know how to get anything except cry for it. Well, now you know, Wilma. Now you have an idea of what it is. I guess you don't know what to say. It's all right. Go on home. Go away like your family said.
I know what to say, Homer. I love you, and I'm never going to leave you. Never.
You mean you didn't mind?
Of course not. I told you I loved you.
I love you, Wilma. I always have, and I always will.
Good night, darling. Sleep well.
Good night, Wilma.
Okay, Dr. Macor, again, not mild, weak dialogue. This isn't happy Hollywood This is stuff that really tugs at the heartstrings.
And it was hard to shoot. I mean, you have two of the most inexperienced actors in the film doing this very important sequence. And it took 3 days to shoot. It was shot toward the end of production, very much on purpose to give them a chance to, get to be comfortable with each other and their characters. That particular shot or series of shots, I can't remember if it's one shot, but where Homer's removing his harness, William Wyler did 18 takes of that. It was a relatively new actor having to do a bit of business with his harness while remembering his lines at the same time. That took time. I don't think I put this in the book, but I loved reading the production reports and going over the notes that the script supervisor made, especially on this sequence. And on one discarded take, the script supervisor wrote, because you have to have a reason for maybe why it's not going to be a good take. And she wrote of Russell, she said, he looked dead. And I think he was probably so exhausted. He just had no emotion on his face at that point.
Okay, well, Buzzkillers, we don't want to give away the whole movie because the ending is fascinating. The ending is kind of a twist, and it is also gripping and upsetting, and does not, again, it's not all happiness ever after. But the film, as a money-making operation, as a thing out there in culture to be sold and looked at and everything else, was a huge success. How does all that happen?
Because it's a good movie and people go to see it and people love it and tell their friends, and it becomes, such a thing that in certain places, like in Britain, it isn't released overseas for about almost a year, maybe like 8 months. Sometimes some theaters are running it 24/7 because the lines are so long that they can't get in exactly when it's starting. So they may get in the middle, and then so they'll stay and they'll watch it the beginning. It's a phenomenon. And Gone with the Wind came out in 1939 and set box office records. So for about 10 years, Best Years was second to only Gone with the Wind in terms of how it did at the box office. It was, I think, dethroned in the 50s, and I'm forgetting the film that did it. But very quickly, I think it was up to $11 million in grosses within about 15 months. It's in the book. I just, those figures don't stay in my head very long anymore. It just was a blockbuster. But at the same time, when the Academy Award nominations were announced, it had some tough competition. The Yearling had come out that same year. Duel in the Sun, another big epic movie by David O. Selznick. That was one of the ones that it was up against.
It's a Wonderful Life.
Wonderful Life. Yes, I was getting to that, which actually came out just 3 weeks after Best Years in December of 46. Interesting thing there, to me at least, is that right after he got back from the war in 1945, Frank Capra, the director of It's a Wonderful Life, who was friendly with William Wyler, approached him and said, I want to start this independent film company, where the directors are in charge. It was a pretty novel thing for that time. And Wyler was like, I'm in. I've got this one film for Sam Goldwyn. He's such a pain in my ass. I'm in. And then they had George Stevens, another filmmaker who's coming back from the war, and then a production manager named Sam Briskin, who I believe was at Columbia. So these men were the core of Liberty Films,
which is the company that makes It's a Wonderful Life.
Right. And It's a Wonderful Life was the first film to be made by Liberty Films. It actually went into production the same day as Best Years of Our Lives, April 1946. Capra and Wyler sent each other telegrams. Capra's telegram said, my first day was easy, but do you know they're using sound today? Which was kind of like a double jab. They were close enough that he could actually make a jab at him about his hearing loss, but also his old age, right? They're using sound. And Wyler wrote, last one in is a rotten egg. And I saw those telegrams, I held them when I was in the archive. It's just amazing to see that kind of primary material. So It's a Wonderful Life came out. It went over budget. It ended up costing about $3 million by the end of its production. And just to give you a context, the average feature at that time cost about $670,000. So, and Best Years also cost about 2 point something million dollars. So these were not small films. Unfortunately, even though It's a Wonderful Life ended up earning about $3.3 million at the box office, given its budget overrun, it really did not help this new company. And another thing that became a problem just, by 1947, within a year of when these films came out, is the declining audience at the movie theater. There were things competing for people's attention, especially people who just come back from the war. So that was another factor.
So how does Best Years of Our Lives do? We mentioned this in the very beginning of the show, highest grossing since Gone with the Wind and all that stuff. But in other respects, how well does the film do?
It's a critical and commercial smash. Basically, the accolades for this film are tremendous. It gets nominated for 8 Oscars. It wins 7 of them. And then it also receives 2 honorary awards, or Goldwyn and Russell received 2. So, 9 awards. And believe me, Goldwyn definitely trumpeted all 9 on the promotion. Like, suddenly the machine goes into action and all of the posters get redone. And it's like, winner of 9 Academy Awards. You get this sense in the coverage of the ceremony that year that there's just this excitement building among those in attendance. I think people were rooting for it as a film. Even though the Yearling was probably Best Year's biggest competition, it's interesting to see how many categories Best Year's went up against It's a Wonderful Life. Like, Jimmy Stewart was up for Best Actor, so was Frederick March. Frederick March won. William Wyler and Frank Capra were both up for Best Director. Wyler won. So you see this play out, which is so interesting. They're business partners too, and they're friends. So it just, blows through the Academy Awards, and then it continues, it goes into general release around the country, and then it's playing overseas. I think it was the first American film to be shown in Germany, and it's rumored that the audience applauded, which was interesting.
Well, why then, if I get back to one of my original statements earlier at the beginning of the show, why then do relatively well? No, I'm gonna make the big statement. Why then do so few people know about it now? This was the biggest film of the late 40s, but now everyone's watched It's a Wonderful Life 40 billion times, and they've never even heard of this one.
Well, I don't think there's one reason, right? There are several reasons. We are living in different times, right? And the kind of unification that may have been felt, especially in that first 9 to 12 months, post-war, I would argue can't be duplicated. It's a Wonderful Life fell into the public domain. And so it got on television in, I think, the 60s. And so it was shown all the time. So that's another very key thing, that people became very familiar with that film because it was on so much. Now, you could argue Best Years is on a lot on Turner Classic Movies, but it's very different from being shown, on TV, the Saturday afternoon movie, the Saturday night movie. So that's one aspect, sort of a logistical aspect. I think, too, that as our wars got more complicated and maybe harder to understand, although I hate to say that because that really glosses over the complications of earlier wars. Even Harold Russell, his son was drafted, I believe, into Vietnam. And Harold Russell spent the rest of his life, he didn't go into acting, he spent the rest of his life being an advocate for veterans' rights. And even he admitted in one of his memoirs, like, he just didn't understand Vietnam. You have a very different feel to that time. And I think maybe this film, people just thought maybe this film wouldn't play in the same way. I mean, Goldwyn brought it back. He reissued it in 1954 during the Korean War. It did well for a reissue, but it was nothing like the reception it had received in 46.
Well, I sometimes wonder whether it's not watched as often, or it's not chosen to be shown as often as It's a Wonderful Life, aside from the public domain thing, when we did a show on that. Because in a way it goes against the myth of World War II as the good war. because in that version of the story, it was all righteous and we did the right thing and everyone came home and it was great and they got the GI Bill and we got the country going again, all this sort of stuff. It got the economy going. And the film is not showing that at all. And I'm sometimes wondering whether, the Freedom Fries crowd and people like that nowadays, or even the past 25 years since Rush Limbaugh started, would think it's very un-American.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, I do think people, certainly at the time, within weeks of it winning its Academy Awards, it was showing up on those lists as unpatriotic, having communist propaganda.
Which it doesn't have any, there's one critic of the war, but he's not even talking about Workers of the World Unite or any of that stuff.
Right.
That was pure McCarthyite, early McCarthyite garbage.
Well, and also I think it was jabs at the people who made the film who were liberal in Hollywood and were supporting people who perhaps were, registered communists. So yeah, then that's, again, what comes to mind is the word challenging. It's a challenging movie. Some people say, well, is it the length? Is it that it's so long? It's hard to program? And, Marvel movies are long and they seem to be programmed. So I think we're talking about content, subject matter. Yeah, I think it's a tough film and not everybody wants to take that on. At the same time, my very first event to promote the book was a screening of this film at the Austin Film Society. And I had a veteran from Afghanistan come up to me afterward and say he'd just seen, an item about the event on the internet, decided to come out. He'd never seen the film and it really spoke to him. And I was just like, yes, this proves my point, that people can still relate to this film. But then I have had conversations with older people who get mad about some of the more gray areas in it. Why did they have that in there? What are they trying to say?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to use this show as a hopefully not Don Quixote-esque charge to try to bring more people to this film. And I also want to bring more people to your book. Now, what we haven't talked about, and we did this on purpose because Buzzkiller should read the book. The book is really about the making of the film. But also, one of the things that struck me so strongly was your final chapter, which was called A Training Film for All of Us, which is a quote from, I think, one of the critics or one of the people promoting the film later on. Mm-hmm. And I think that title still applies now. This film does teach us that things were not hunky-dory after the war. It does teach us that there's a range of emotions about the war, after the war, and on and on and on.
I agree. And I think it teaches us how to be compassionate human beings. Going back to Homer as a disabled character, it's really a groundbreaking portrayal. And there is a moment in the movie where there's a gentleman at the soda counter who wants to talk to him and is sort of just like leaning in, and Homer turns to him and says, "Hi." It's just this amazing moment that to me is just, it's not acting, it's what every disabled person has to do in a social situation like that. And I find that so affecting.
Yeah, and there are a number of scenes in the movie like that, and I can't remember many other movies that had that many scenes like that, and it made me stop and think as much as I did when I saw this. So please, Buzzkillers, I insist, go see the movie. It's on Amazon. It's on all sorts of streaming services. If you got Turner Classic Movies, if that still exists anymore, I don't even know. It's on. It's perfectly accessible to watch it. It will change the way you think about a lot of things about the movie industry, but also about the World War II and the immediate post-war period. But also, I'm insisting, and again, I'm bringing out all my Buzzkill bluster here, you must get this book. And there are 1,000 reasons you must get this book. One is, of course, it talks about the movie, but it's really the background, the discussion of the background production of the movie that's absolutely gripping. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. You need to go order it the minute we stop talking. So, Professor, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for reading the book and wanting to talk about it.
Well, we want to read your next book, so please email me. Let's talk about what that is. and we'll start planning a show, and maybe start insisting on Buzzkillers seeing those films that you're going to talk about in that book.
Okay. I will say it's a very different movie. But it's another making of book about a very different movie.
Okay. Well, we'll leave them hanging because we want to catch them unaware. All right, Buzzkillers, do what I just told you to do. Go watch the movie. Go buy the book. You will not regret it. And we will talk to all of you next week.